Okay. We're a couple of minutes to start time. So we'll see as people start to come online this year. We'll try to start shortly after 8. I see we have a couple people on Facebook, which is nice. Looks like we have people from the regular shears here who lives in Pittsburgh, who lives across the country. Adelson, I see as well. I'm going to ask that we, as a chavra starts to build together over the course of the next minute, I think it would be appropriate if we are together virtually to take a moment to say a chapter of Tehillim on behalf of ourselves and our families, for our community, for Klal Yisrael, and really for the whole world that is in an Sarah at the moment. It really would be, I think, a wonderful gesture to try to at least virtually Adonai Roi Lo Echsar B'Nos Deshe Yaritzeni Almei Menuchosi Nahaleni Nafshi Shovev Yenacheni V'Magli Tzedek L'man Shemo Gam Ki Roi Dishanta V'Shemen Roshi Kosi Revaya Achtov Chesed Yirtefuni Kol Yemei Chayai V'Shavti B'Beis Adonai L'Orech Yamim Avram B'Skar Zegosh Baruchim Ali Rachim Aleim Lachlimam L'Raposam Lachzikom Lachiyosam V'Shlach Lehem Meiror Fuash Lehem Shamayim Cholerem Chogidim Esoshar Choli. I think 8 years at this point. We've slowly been making our way through Chumash. We started at the beginning of Parshas Lech Lecha, again, roughly 8 years ago, and we are now in the middle of Parshas Shmos. We're in chapter 4 of Shmos, Perek Dalid, Pasuk Yud Ches, 4:18. Again, those of you on Facebook, I put links in. This really is an inside textual shiur, so it helps to have a Tanakh or a Chumash or the screen open in front of you to be able to actually look inside at the psukim that we're discussing. And really the goal of the shiur is to dig deep in the psukim, to try to see the complexity, the variety of possibilities that exist in terms of how to interpret the psukim, both in terms of what we're able to discern and to better appreciate what many of the classical Mefarshim, the Rishonim, the Achronim, contemporary writers, right, how each of them brings a new perspective to understanding the dynamics within the drama between God and Moshe at the burning bush, where Moshe is tasked by God, and that we see in the psukim 5 times where Moshe interjects and inserts essentially either clarifications, objections. It's not always 100% clear for the Mefarshim how to read these things. Now, are these data points that Moshe wants to clarify with God, or are these roadblocks that Moshe is putting in the way of accept? What we have here is essentially the roughest outline of the dialogue. The dialogue really takes place over the course of 7 days. Right? That finally Moshe apparently is ready to embrace the mission that God has entrusted him with. So again, I'm one of the most beautiful parts of this year is the interaction, the discussion. I'm not quite up there technologically yet in terms of having that element included, but we'll do the best that we can. We'll do the best that we can together. Okay, so we're chapter 4, verse 18. Vayelech Moshe vayashel yeser chosno vayomer. And over the course of Chumash, a number of relatives of Moshe by marriage are mentioned. Right? We have a number of them who are mentioned in the psukim. Whether they are all, as Rashi maintains here, the same person or perhaps different people is a little bit unclear. Certainly, contextually, it seems that they are Mitzrayim, and I will return to my brothers who are in Egypt. And I will see if they are still alive. Vayomer Yisrael Moshe lech l'shalom. And Moshe says to Yisrael, go in peace. Now, again, we'll take a minute. Again, if anybody wants to try to of the either of the feeds here, and if not, we'll have to kind of do this the old-fashioned way. Okay, so let's try like this. As part of the story, that Moshe goes to Yisro and says to him, essentially, can I go to Egypt? Which is go directly to Egypt without passing go, is a function of certain practical things that need to be done. So the Chizkuni suggests that this is, again, perhaps as practical as possible. When he was in the wilderness, when he had this encounter with God, of course, he was there in his role as shepherd, right? He was a shepherd, and the Torah tells us an almost humdrum kind of detail, the idea that Moshe has to, put the sheep back where they belong, but also perhaps gives us a certain idea of the notion of responsibility, that even with a monumental, world-altering mission in the Talmud, discussions of financial responsibility is the whole topic of shomrim, of people who are context of the time of the Gemara. But I think the idea that somehow this is a very basic representation of responsibility. The Moshe has to give the sheep back before he continues. And we're going to see the idea that Moshe takes his family, and there's going to be a tremendous spread among the Mefarshim as to understand why the family has to go. Rashi has a midrashic approach based on a pasuk. Again, if you want to see it inside, it is the end of chapter 2, pasuk Chaf Aleph, base Chaf Aleph 221. When it describes Moshe's decision to live with Yisro, Rashi goes to Medrash that the word Vayoel, it's a relatively unusual kind of word, can be understood as to take an oath, right? And the idea, again, Vayoel Moshe Lasheves Es Ha'ish, perhaps we would translate it, Moshe decided to dwell with the man. The Rashi understands it midrashically as also meaning that Moshe took an oath to stay with Yisro, right? That Yisro essentially said, as part of the deal of becoming part of the family, into the family, right? Some people have such in-laws. And so according to this approach, and Rashi quotes it here as well, that Moshe had to go back to be released from his vow, right? That he administered this vow, and he couldn't leave without permission. Again, that really brings up is somewhat evasive in terms of, it seems, in terms of the real purpose of his mission. Right? He certainly doesn't say, well, God came to me in a vision and told me to take the Jews out of Egypt. He presents it as, I'm going to go back to see the family in Egypt. Right? There's nothing else which is addressed here at all. One wonders, there is another midrashic tradition about Yisro that talks about the idea of Yisro as actually a refugee himself. When Paro was in the process of ramping up to his genocidal, infanticidal policies towards the Jewish people, right? Yisro at that moment had enough, right? He wasn't willing to comply on this. So instead, Yisro leaves, right? Yisro hits the road, he runs and he returns to his people in Midian. And again, according to the Medrash, there's actually a trio of advisors. It's a whole fascinating idea in its own right, together with the other prominent biblical figures, Eov and Bilam, right, who are all almost kind of the council of the wise of the nations, right? That the Midrash places them as being either complicit or protesting Paro's decisions. So I wonder about the oath, that in trying to understand the Midrashic portrait of Yisro, that Yisro, on the one hand, in certain ways, one could view as someone who is escaping from evil. In other words, he saw what was going on by Paro. He felt unable to really impact what was happening, that there was no way that he was going to have influence. So instead, he retreats, right? Which is, again, certainly one response to evil. And the idea that basically he says, look, I'm going to live here. I'm going to live in a bubble. I'm going to be a religious quester over here. But that I'm done. There's nothing perhaps that can be achieved in Egypt. And the idea that he, being familiar perhaps with Moshe's career in Egypt, he says, look, you want to marry into the family, terrific, but no more, is part of, according to this approach of Rashi's, that the key issue here is the release from the vow, maybe, and again, here I'm being completely speculative in terms of what was involved. So the question becomes, so there are other approaches that we find in the Mefarshim to this question of why he does not expressly tell Yisro what's going on, right? Gives them, as it were, something of a cover story. The Arachaim suggests that there is actually there are constraints on what a prophet is allowed to divulge to people who are not the primary the primary audience of the prophecy. In other words, Moshe is told to go to the Jews. He's told to go to Paro. But again, that this is not, he's not given divine license, to take out a Twitter account and start telling anybody who's interested what he's up to. Right? He is charged with a mission at a specific time, at a specific place. So the Ohr HaChaim says he doesn't have permission to relay this particular information. The Ksava Kabbalah takes a different approach. I think is in its own way quite fascinating. He says that perhaps that Yisro will be a sympathetic, washed his hands of Egypt, wants nothing more to do with it, doesn't want Moshe going back there. He's done. Right? The Ksava Kabbalah entertains the possibility that he is on some level retains his sympathies to the Egyptians. Now this is rooted in one Talmudic understanding of a later pasuk about Yisro, right? Again, we're going to have a scene in the parsha that carries his name where Yisro comes back, and we are again, the Torah confronts us with a relatively obscure word, right? Obscure words always open us up to multiple interpretations, right? So the Torah there tells us in chapter 18, pasuk Perak Yitches, pasuk Tes 89, Vayichad Yisro chads. We'll come back to the chad in a second. Al kol hatovah asher asa Hashem liYisrael asher yitzilom yad Mitzrayim. So the word vayichad is somewhat obscure, right? So there is a word chedva, which means joy in Hebrew, right? So Yisrael uses various Aramaic forms, right? Unusual Hebrew words in order to almost give us a clue into Yisro's accent. He develops a whole theory about the relationship of Midian. He talks about different places where Midian lived. And goes through a number of examples in his Reviel Ben Nun, who thank God is alive today, one of the most prolific and creative Tanakh minds in the world today. Right, goes through this whole approach in Aramaic also means happy. So the other interpretation that we find of this phrase in the Gemara is Naaseh v'saro chadudin chadudin, right? That he got goosebumps, that he became viscerally uncomfortable, right, when dealing with the pain of the Egyptians. Now again, we're holding. I know a lot of us don't necessarily want to hear this yet. We're 2 weeks from the Seder, and the truth is that there is, that I often feel that there's something a little bit off, in the practice that people seem to develop today of playing games around the Makos, right, around the plagues. Plagues are serious business, like the idea of terms, right, and the idea that we have bouncy toys and melodies to talk about the plagues. There's a place to discuss that. But the Medrash says the Paro had, let's call it a soft spot for the Egyptians and their suffering. So this approach of the Ksava Kabbalah projects this back of these kinds of sympathies to the Egyptians, so therefore not to tell him. Now, perhaps the most fascinating approach of this, which is developed by the Malbim and to some degree the Ramban as well, suggests that Moshe is not engaged in any kind of subterfuge vis-a-vis Yisro at all, but that this is exactly his intention. Moshe's intention is to go to Egypt, not permanently, right? That he does not see his mission as something long-term. He says, so the way the Malbim develops it is like this, that if you carefully read the charge that God gave in the last psukim at the burning bush, he says, Shashlichus rak sheyelech el paro, v'yisrebo she shalach es Yisrael l'chug b'midbar. The Moshe's mission was to go to Paro and to tell him, send the Jews to go celebrate for God in the desert. Yeah, and Paro's not going to listen. And then Moshe's assumption, reading the Psukim, and again, it's interesting, go back to the Psukim and read this in, is that then God is going to work wonders himself, right? That Moshe has no expectations, according to the Malbim at this point in the story, that he is going to be the conduit. People know that God has remembered them. And that's the whole thing. God's going to do all the rest by himself. And that God tells him that he's going, that God is going down into Egypt, to save them from Egypt. Expressly says to Moshe, you're going to be the one to take that. Right? So the Malbim says that Moshe's understanding is that this is a delimited mission. It's not a question that he's signing up for a life career as being the leader of the Jewish people. That after this, he's going to go back to Egypt. So the way that he's going to go back to Midian, right? That he's going, he has he books a two-way ticket. He's going to go to Egypt. He's going to do what he needs to do. Then he's going to come back. What does he need to stay for? And so the Malbim says that, and really this part is based on the Ramban. He says Elchana ve'ashuva. He says, I'm going to go and come back. Now again, the simpler way of parsing the pasuk is that you read it, I will go and then I will return to my brothers in Egypt. Right? But again, reading the pasuk, he says that that's all that Moshe thinks he's signed up to do. That this is something which is a temporary kind of business. Right? And this part of the function of this is, if you take a look for, will seem totally redundant. Hashem says to Moshe, when you're going to return to Egypt, he says, see all of the wonders that I am putting into your hand. Right, that this is going back permanently to Egypt. You're going to come back to Midian and go back to your family. Right, that this is really a temporary kind of possibility. So again, a number of, he's not allowed to share his nevuah yet, that we saw in the Orach Chaim. Number two, the possibility that he was concerned that Yisro would not identify with this mission. He would be sympathetic for whatever reasons, for humanitarian reasons, because of his own past, right, with the fate of the Egyptians, or that this is really what Moshe thought that he was doing, that he thought that this was a relatively limited mission. Okay, any other questions? I'll take a quick look at the various feeds. Any other questions on this pasuk? Okay. Good. We will continue to pasuk Yutes. And we find what seems to be a bit of a non sequitur. Hashem says to Moshe, B'Midyan, while he's still in Midyan, Lech Shuv Mitzrayim, go back to Egypt. Right, he was a wanted man. Right, that he was his slaying of the Egyptian had become known. Paro tries to kill him. Right, every post office in Mitzrayim is a big picture of Moshe up. Right, so Moshe is hiding out in Midian. Right, we talked about the approach that says he specifically goes to a place that is, as it were, on the edge of civilization. Right, out in, that he's spending most of his time in the wilderness with the sheep, right, where nobody knows who he is. Nobody's gonna. In Midian, tells him to go back to Egypt, because everybody who would pose a danger to you has already died. Now, this is a little bit strange, right? When should this message have been given to Moshe, if that's the case? Should have been given back by the snap, right? And again, I have to check my notes again. That there's at least one commentary who suggests that it's this issue which is one pushing back, right? What is Moshe really concerned about? We'll revisit that issue still this evening. But the question is, maybe this is really what underlies everything, right? That he was concerned about this particular issue. So we have to figure out what that's about. Secondly, within these psukim, we have a focus on the idea that these people who wanted to kill you and the people around him, right? That's the way that even Ezra understands it. Now, the difficulty is that we know expressly that Paro dies before the whole encounter at the sneh, right? That we have at the end of chapter 2. So if this is, why didn't God tell Moshe this at the very outset? In other words, if that's really what it's about, give him the message as soon as it happens. Why give this message now, which we'll have to revisit. The Chizkuni offers another possibility, which again evades this issue, that what the concern here is that he killed, right? He says the Krove HaMitzri Shaharagda, the relatives of the Egyptian that you killed. Right, so I think the Chizkuni, the beauty of the Chizkuni's approach is as follows. So it means you don't have to deal with the timeline question of the fact that Paro dies before the whole stand, right? That God promises him when he said that Paro will not harm him, but he has no promise about the Goel Adam, right? About the idea that there are these, there's the McCoys are out there waiting to jump him as soon as he comes to Egypt. So he has to be told, in addition, that the family is not an issue as well. So that's the second approach, right? The third approach, which is what we find in Rashi based on the Medrash, is that this is a reference specifically to the individuals, the Aviram lining, right? So Das and Aviram, according to the Midrash, are the same people who are fighting in Egypt that Moshe tries to break up, right, and mouth off to him, which again, part of the midrashic bridge between those two stories, right, is that these are perhaps the two most brazen rejections of Moshe's leader. This is one of the midrashim that Cecil B. DeMille adopted in his epic movie, The Ten Commandments, right, where Dathan is a Moshe's antagonist from the beginning of the movie until the end. The only problem is that I think they realized it was 4.5 hours long, and they were only at Parshas Kisisa, right? So they kind of collapsed the whole story of Korach into the Egel HaZahav and made it all one big mishmash at that point, so they could finally roll the credits, right? But the idea of measures, right? So Rashi says here that this is a reference to Das and Aviram. Now, of course, the obvious problem is Das and Aviram are still alive, right? We know they're alive. Their influence, right? Again, we've mentioned before on some level, that we sometimes think about, and this is certainly a worthwhile state of the Jews economically and really socio-culturally was in Egypt, right? So sometimes, in filling in the story, we picture the Jews in Egypt like concentration camp inmates. And certainly that may have been true, and may have been true for some of them at some time, but it's a complicated kind of model. And certainly we have some evidence to suggest that there was a privileged class within the Jewish people as well in Egypt, right? That they were, it's interesting to note, the Meshech Chochmah writes in themselves slave owners, and that there was an internal process of liberation that needed to happen before they were redeemed from Egypt. But that he has this fascinating speculation that it was Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, and of course Das and Aviram are from Reuven, that were part of this class. So if we kind of meld this all together, right, the idea that the impoverishment, and again, the quotes a Gemara that talks about the idea that someone who becomes impoverished, kind of concept for another time. But this is really not about Paro and not about the family of the person that Moshe killed, but it's about Dasan and the idea that Moshe's real anxiety vis-a-vis dealing with the Jews, right? Dealing with Paro, no big deal. That he could handle. Perhaps there he had the life experience, there he had the promise from God. But the way that Netziv read many of the reaction of the Jewish people, which again would be consistent with the idea, and again here within Rashi, that Moshe, that one of the subtexts of the story of the Sneh is that Moshe was skeptical about the merits of the Jewish people, right? Remember, Moshe's own last engagement with the Jews was the whole incident with the fighting Jews, right? Where again, Moshe perhaps had a certain romanticized vision of what, the descendants of Avram and Sarah were all about, right? And that he does this dramatic action to try to save this one Jew. And then he finds that there is this internal strife within the Jewish people. There's a tremendous kind of sense of disillusionment, right? That, like, this is Klal Yisrael, this is the Achdus, the unity. These people don't deserve it, right? And in fact, Rashi interprets, if you remember, a number of the signs that Moshe is entrusted at the burning bush, right? That Moshe is really being told by God, you got to go easy on the Jewish people, right? You have to, if you're going to be their leader, you need to sympathize with them, you need to identify them, and so forth. So the Netziv says that this midrash, that it's Dasan and Aviram, that those were the people that Moshe was really the most nervous about, right? And again, the truth is that throughout Moshe's career, right, we'll see that there is, right, this is the person who is the closest human being ever to God, who has this unique relationship to God. But at the same time, that's who this should be about. Now, so that's the question of who we're talking about. But the bigger question is, why are we talking about this? In other words, why does God have to tell Moshe specifically at this juncture that the people who wanted to kill you are gone? Don't worry about that. That's off the scene. Now, so one possibility, right? It's interesting. The Ibn Ezra suggests that this takes place achar yamim rabim chadashim shenira hamalch b'sneh. So he just says that this must take place after significant time passes from the sneh, right? So that and while he doesn't elaborate on this, I think that the assumption that the Ibn Ezra is making here, right, is why does Moshe need, as it were, a second notice? It must be that Moshe is not responded yet to the mission that he was entrusted with, right? And so therefore, this is a second installment, as it were, of a reminder of that mission. I think it's a very interesting question in terms of, again, I've alluded to this before. The Torah does not actually give us, really from the time of Moshe's birth until we're told in Parashat Va'era that Moshe was 80 when he engages with Paro for the sea, intervening, the first 80 years of Moshe's life. So there are midrashim, but there's something fungible about this as well, right? Moshe coming to Paro the second time, and we have all kinds of other things that happen. Moshe kills an Egyptian, he runs, he comes to Midian, he gets married, the sneh, the first mission to Paro, and it's really a little bit of an open question. We can amass evidence in different ways. All of those various directions, and we'll see again as we come to the end of the parasha, both the Ramban and in a much more dramatic way, Rabbi Yaakov Midan suggests that therefore the new this new mission statement, or this new, again, reminder, go back to Egypt and you have nothing to worry about. Assumed that the original, that Moshe's original trip to Egypt, at least in Moshe's head, was he was there basically for a short period of time. He used to tell Paro, tell the Jews, this is what's coming, that Moshe had not yet accepted being a leader, right? That's the approach of the Malbim. So the Malbim follows and says, this is told, no. You got to actually go there. You thought you were going for a quick trip, and long enough to have problems. He says, don't worry, it's a new situation, but you are going to Mitzrayim now, right? You're there for the long haul, right? And so therefore, don't worry about the things that maybe once you were going for a week, you weren't nervous about. But it's a way of telling him, no, you got to go there. You got to put down roots. You have to be there with the people you're there with for the long haul. Risham Shmuel Hirsch says, in certain ways, a variation on that idea, right? That this is actually a call on Moshe to take his family. Why? Because what do we find in the next pasuk? Moshe takes his wife and children. Now, again, our next time together, we're going to have to talk about what the function is of them coming along, right? Again, until now, there was no statement that Moshe's family needs to go to Egypt. We'll find in a few psukim one of the most perplexing, baffling stories in the Torah about an incident that happens to Moshe and his wife and one of his children, and who we're going to have to work out all the details on that, right? So there is something significant about Moshe's family being in the picture. It's a very brief window. So Rav Hirsch says that Moshe did not intend to take his family to Egypt at all, right? The Moshe's intention was, I'm going to go by myself. And again, his language is quite fascinating. Rav Hirsch says that Moshe was not afraid to put himself in danger, right? That he was tasked with the mission of going to Egypt, but he was afraid about the vulnerability of his family. He says that he knew that the family would be in danger, and he says that there is no family that is as much compromised. This is the Hebrew translation. Again, if I was being authentic, I'd say it in German. He says, he says that there is no comparison of a family involved in public affairs in terms of, let's call them the danger of people in the rabbinate, the vulnerability of their families who didn't sign up for the job. It's an issue even today, that the people who are on the front lines in battling the effects of coronavirus, whether we're talking about medical professionals or even grocery store workers, the idea that even if they want to be heroic, that their family is not, is not in the issue. So the Rav Hirsch says that this is a promise from God that don't worry that you're going to go to Egypt and your enemies are going to go after your family. I'm telling you that your family is neutralized. The dangers to your family are neutralized, and therefore you can bring them with you, right? So again, the Malbim says it's a message to Moshe that you're going for the long haul, right? Again, Simone said it's a quick business trip versus relocation. This is the idea, family coming is important. So the Or HaChaim brings a third possibility, and the Or HaChaim suggests that the issue here is to tell us about Moshe's, in the end of the day, notwithstanding all of his demurrals to take on the mission, that once Moshe accepted the mission, his issue was not his own personal safety. In other words, his assumption was that God specifically did not tell Moshe at the outset, don't worry, nobody's going to kill you. That we have to appreciate that Moshe accepted it when he still thought there was a mortal danger because of, the most wanted list hanging after him. Says the Or HaChaim, therefore God only tells him this after the fact, right? Because that is, again, an indication that Moshe would have gone even had he not known that. So it's really a testament, according to the Or HaChaim, of Moshe's faith. Now, it's interesting that the Meshech Chachma, and there's a lot to say about this Meshech Chachma and where the Meshech Chachma is coming from, and it has a lot, which is quite interesting. And again, also something significant to think about, again, during a time of danger. The Meshech Chachma says that Im hayu chayim hamvakshim es nafsho lo yatzarich lalech lotzei v'nisram mitzrayim. He says that if there was a mortal danger from these enemies, the Meshech Chachma's understanding is that he would have been halachically exempt from the mitzvah. He says, Afal pi shekol tzri yisur himself, and he goes on a whole approach here. So again, reversing the Meshech Chachma and reversing the Or HaChaim here take essentially opposite positions. The Or HaChaim tells us that the Torah tells us only at this juncture that there's no danger to Moshe in order to affirm the fact. that Moshe, of his own free will, was willing to accept the danger and accept Hashem's mission. And the Meshech Chachma says this is actually the halachic permission for him to override the normal concern that we don't place ourselves in a place of danger. All right, we'll stop here for the week. I'm not 100% sure yet about whether we will continue Chumash next week. I'm looking at scheduling some Pesach related here. And again, that to have this opportunity, even if we are socially distanced, to be able to come together through Talmud Torah.